Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Future of Design Tokens panel. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to talk all about design tokens all day today, and we have some amazing guests here to kind of help talk through a bunch of those things. We're also going to do a Q&A. Thank you all for joining. For those of you who are joining the live stream, we would love to hear your questions as well. So we're going to have a lively panel talking about design tokens with everyone here. We have our own questions and things to discuss, but we also want to know what you all want to know about design tokens as well. For those of you joining the live stream, there is a Q&A panel in here. So if you pop open that, you can paste your questions in that. We'll keep an eye on that and answer some of those questions along the way. We'll also have a dedicated time for Q&A at the end. We'll reserve about 15 or 20 minutes at the end of this webinar for just some open Q&A. So please feel free to post questions in the chat. You can also upvote questions. So if you have a similar question, feel free to upvote ones. That'll give us a good sense of what everybody wants to talk about and what we are going to talk about today. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for being here. Let's start with a couple of intros. Let's just go around the room with our awesome panelists here. And for my panelists here, if you would just give a one-sentence description of who you are, what you do, where you work, and one sentence about your experience with design tokens. I'll choose the first person, and then if you would popcorn it over to the next person. Donna, would you mind going first?
Hi, everyone. I'm Donna Vitan. I am the design technologist working at TELUS, which is one of the largest technology companies in Canada. And I'm leading the design systems here. And also, one of the things that I'm working on is really kind of leveraging design tokens for our organization as our design system grows to serve the larger organization, because we have multiple products, multiple organizations within it. And then also I'm a member of the design tokens working group, which, I'll pass on to Jina.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jina. I am a manager on the design and developer relations team for material design at Google. My experience with tokens is I was on the team that came up with them at Salesforce for the Lightning Design System team. And then I'm also on the community group as a co-chair. I will kick it over to Nathan.
Thanks, Gina. Hi, I'm Nathan Curtis. I'm a design system consultant from 8Shapes. I've been working on design systems for a while and have been one of the beneficiaries of Gina and the Salesforce's team's good ideas since around 2015. And since then, I've been working with clients to create token taxonomies, naming things and integrating them into their component catalogs. I'll throw it over to Kaelig.
Hey there, I'm Kaelig. I work at Netlify on the engineering team, where I'm actually working on design tokens right now with our amazing design team. And in the past, I've worked alongside Gina on the Lightning Design System at Salesforce, and then followed up with Polaris at Shopify. And excited to be here today.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Dan Mull. I'm the moderator for today. So I'll be asking all these awesome folks some questions. I'm a design system consultant and content creator, and we're talking all about design tokens today. So kind of to kick us off, Gina, if you don't mind, if we would start with you, we're going to start from the very basics in this panel and then kind of go and talk about more advanced stuff. But the most basic is, what is a design token? Could you kind of tell us a little bit about what that is, maybe how that came to be, and feel free to be a bit generous about your answer here. So take the time to answer as you want.
Sure. I can't help but want to make the spicy variables joke, but that aside, so I think part of this answer is also explaining why they're called design tokens in the first place. So back at Salesforce, when you were doing sort of like what would be considered a variable in CSS preprocessors, they would do token strings, which is a lot like what you would do when you were when you're localizing content. You wrap it in a token, and then you can pass in different data. And so they weren't using a CSS preprocessor at the time, like SAS or anything like that. And so they were using token strings to do it. And then that data would get filled in with like XML data. So we were using that in what it used to be called Aura, and then it became what is known now as Lightning, like the Lightning platform. The design token thing kind of was an idea that came from our team of like, how do we store our information in one place and distribute it out into all the various platforms we needed, like iOS, Android, whether people were on Java, whether they were using Sass, or if they were using less stylus. We just had so many different teams working on different things that we needed something scalable. And so that's where it came from. It's interesting because I think a lot of people do tend to talk about them and use them as if they're just variables, but they can take other forms than variables, which is something that I like to remind people of. So I tried to do it very briefly so I don't take up too much time. So hopefully that helps explain it.
That was excellent. And I'm glad that you started with that too, because as long as I've been working on tokens, I actually never heard that origin story. I didn't know that they started that way. So really cool, cool trivia there. How about we pass over to Donna? Donna, you're a designer. As a designer, can you talk a little bit about how design tokens influence your workflow, if at all? Do designers use design tokens, or is it just an engineering thing? I mean, I assume that they use design tokens because there's the word design in it, but I don't know, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you and the people that you work with use design tokens.
I'm going to start off with everybody here has influenced how I have consumed design tokens and how I have tried to use it in our design system, from the perspective of, in a design system, how do we best share that knowledge or those variables across our tooling and our design tools and our language, so that we're all talking about the same thing, whether it's design or development. And so the way we use design tokens right now, I know there's such a growth in tool standardization, but right now we're really super simple in that we have captured colors, sizes, typography as our base components, and then we use them within our themes, which is already in their components. So we're kind of really taking baby steps on how we use design tokens, and right now we're being conservative of hey, do we do the tokens Figma plugins and that kind of stuff? It's because there's just so much groundwork to do that by having the foundations of design tokens already, we're already leveraging that to multiple platforms. So start small, and then you could also spread out as you have capacity and effort.
Awesome. I love that. We're going to come back to that idea later on about how do you spread out, once you have those foundations set. How about Kaelig, over to you? It's kind of same question to you, but maybe from an engineering standpoint. They're called design tokens. Do engineers use those as well? Have you used them before? At Shopify, at Netlify, all the places that you've been at, how do you use design tokens? How do engineers use design tokens?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So the way I've been using design tokens is coming back to my UX roots and understanding how we get engineers and designers to speak the same language. I'll also throw in product in there because I've seen it being super useful to align everyone on how we name things across the app, especially when we started doing a lot of responsive websites, and even the breakpoint names, all these viewport sizes that we had to start talking about efficiently and across disciplines, that needs to be encoded somewhere. So what I'm always trying to do is understand the intent of each design decision and how can we translate that to code so that it flows back from design into code. And I've seen other teams doing it the other way around. And I'm not saying it's not valid, but my way of doing it is more to understand where it comes from in the design perspective.
Awesome. Thank you for that. There's a lot of words that you mentioned in there, like intent, like design decisions, that I hope that we come back to in a few minutes. So we'll make sure to come back to that. Nathan, how about you? As a consultant, you've worked with a ton of different teams. You've helped create token taxonomies. You've written a lot of the articles and resource guides that lots of people follow as their way to implement design tokens. Can you talk a little bit about what's the process that you tend to use when you're working with teams and helping them establish design tokens and design token guide? Where does it all fit in? How do you tend to think about them?
Well, I think it actually starts with how you frame the question, which is different kinds of teams encounter tokens at different moments of their really journey in creating a system. For some teams, they're just setting up the baseline catalog. They're creating the first generation of their design systems. And so in that way, the tokens work can be part of discussing and solidifying what the visual language is. And so it really creates, in part, the foundation of everything else that they build. And so it's very early, and typically it starts with color. And then it bridges into typography and all the other dimensions that the other panelists talked about. More often these days, I see teams scaling their design system because they're trying to solve problems that they couldn't solve before. And two of the most prevalent ones are they have a visual language and it might be going through a brand refresh, or they want to do something like dark mode where implicitly they already had light mode, or they want to theme things based on varying brands. And so they find themselves in a moment where they need to revisit the taxonomy that they have. It's not robust enough, or it wasn't implemented precisely enough or thoroughly enough through their catalog. And so as a consultant, I find myself alongside that sort of rewiring of everything on the inside of all of their components. The other one is really they're trying to generate the agreement that Kaelig talked about around a shared language. And so a lot of teams are thinking about the components that expose properties and other kinds of pieces of anatomy and so on across all of their different tools for designers and engineers. And so tokens becomes one of the pieces to normalize their API and the terms they use across their design language. And so tokens aren't necessarily the focus, but when you start to really look at those things across the catalog, they become something that is significantly impacted as they go through that process to change.
I love it. In the last 14 minutes that we've been talking about this, we went from like almost spicy variables all the way to a tool of scale across an entire organization. Spicy, well done, Kaelig. Excellent. Spicy variable. Yeah. So let's talk about the things that support design tokens from process to tooling. Let's start with tools. What have you all seen and used and built and homegrown in terms of what tools do you use when it comes to design tokens? Is there good tooling out there? Are you creating everything from scratch? Is this a manual thing? Do designers and engineers use the same tools or different tools? What have you all seen in terms of what kind of tools exist out there? And I'll kind of throw it out to the entire panel. So whoever wants to go first, feel free to jump in.
I'll go. Well, I wanted to start by saying, like, I guess the prototype of what became like a way of doing design tokens was actually using a static site generator, middleman. When I was working on the SAS website, I was using basically YAML data and converting that into SAS variables as well as CSS or CSS classes and HTML, and everything was being generated off of that. And that's what I used to demo to the team when we were trying to come up with ideas that then led to the creation of Theo. And then Theo is Salesforce's open source tool. It was the first of its kind that I'm aware of, at least. And since then, a lot have generated, or a lot have spun up that do the same thing of generating tokens. So like Style Dictionary is a very popular one. There's so many. It's hard to name them all, but what I find interesting is there's also tools that have spun up that are more design tool centric. So like, you got plugins like Figma tokens, you have like, even the product that you used to have, Dan, called Arcade, rest in peace. And when I was at Amazon, we even used Envision's DSM, which was very limited, and it would generate color and type, and that was pretty much as far as it would go. But yeah, there's a lot. The landscape is quite large.
Yeah, maybe I can touch on why we want those tools to exist in the first place. So to get those design decisions into the hands of the users, there's like a supply chain that needs to happen. And for that concept to go from the designer's brain to a user's screen, there's a bunch of steps along the way, and one of them is getting them into code. So that's where the tools come in, and there's a whole pipeline that you can imagine that goes typically from a single source of truth that contains all of your tokens, or gathers all the tokens and deciding decisions from multiple areas of your design process, I suppose, and then redistributes it into platform and device specific ways of talking about tokens. So for example, you will want to have CSS variables, you will want to have maybe XML for Android, you will want to have some Objective-C and Swift versions of those tokens so that they're consistently coming from the same place, but also distributed in a way that talks to all these systems. And I would say there is a lot of good tooling out there, but it's not turnkey. That's the thing that I think is really missing so far, is that we want to have ways for people to get into the mood of putting design tokens together without even thinking about, oh my gosh, like what are the levels of engineering that will need to involve in the process. So for me, it's that engineering friction that still exists, and even on the design side, I'm not sure that design tools are where they can be. So lots of good tooling out there, just requires a bit of effort.
So maybe I can add. So like in our design system, in our organization, we're all still kind of figuring out what that path is to like multi-platform and multi-branding. So we haven't really relied on external tools and just kind of building our own translation and automation kind of thing to go from like Android, iOS, from our primarily web-based components and design tokens. So I think the thing with relying on tools right now is like, as a large organization, you know, there's a lot of work to review. Does this tool do everything we need it to and what we potentially need it to? And then also the way that design tokens right now is we have a small foundational design tokens, and it's kind of still a lot of education within the design community, and be like, hey, you know, this color can only be used for borders, and like which borders or that kind of stuff. So there's still a lot of education on like what can be used. As well, like right now, in order to use our design system, we're trying to limit, like, here's the technologies we are support, and here's the tool we use. Figma as like the tool that we design with. And if you're not using that, you know, how do people have access to those design decisions? And that's something that right now we're waiting for that to kind of be resolved, waiting for the expertise to kind of chime in. But for the most part, again, keeping an eye on what's going on so that we can prepare ourselves for that.
Yeah, I would amplify what Donna said to say that the teams that I work with make distinct choices based on the conditions and circumstances that they're in. And so there are some teams that are all in on Figma tokens, for example, and it has helped solve a lot of their problems. And there are other teams that are either unable to license it or secure it based on their constraints. And they're dealing with the limitations of manual things they can do with some kinds of tokens within Figma as a tool based on the native capabilities that it has. And then a third class of companies that are just playing wait and see and waiting for Figma to integrate it and waiting for another tool to solve all the problems they need to really jump in, because systems are big enough now that you can't jump from tool to tool every couple of months, because this is serious, expensive, and highly integrated work that you're doing.
Makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of questions about tools in the chat. We're going to come back to those in just a minute, but I think this is a good segue to talk a little bit to Jina and Kaelig specifically. Both of you are co-chairs of a thing called the Design Tokens Community Group. So as co-chairs, first question, how do you feel about being referred to as furniture? And second question is, what is the community group for? What is it doing? Maybe you can tell us about why that work is important. So over to the two of you, whoever wants to go first, please jump in.
Well, designers are supposed to try to get a seat at the table. Why not become the seat? You know, I'm a co-chair. Sorry, dad joke. Okay. You know what? I focused in on the joke, and my brain just went. What was the second part of the question again?
The second part of the question is what is the working group doing, and why is that work important? The community.
Yeah. So we did just mention a lot of different tools. One of the problems that was coming about was that a lot of tools were wanting to integrate design tokens, but they could all kind of like do it their own way, and then it kind of becomes a proprietary thing, and it's hard to like move things from one thing to the other. So Kaelig is he can speak more to initially like spinning the group up, but the idea there is coming up with a standard API so that these tools have something to rely on to be able to have that. And so maybe Kaelig can go into more detail there.
Yeah, I'm not going to jump into too much detail, but yeah, from now on I do identify as furniture. So so yeah, the idea of the design token community group is that there's been a lot of work being done by various experts in the field already that were thinking about this. That said, there's never been mass tooling adoption across the board. So for example, we want the Figmas, the Adobe, the Sketches of this world to be included in the loop and making sure that if we're going to ship something, it's definitely aligned across those platforms. And I call them platforms as in like a design platforms. The idea is to have those experts on the group instead of in their own little bubbles. And we also have Valhead as a third co-chair, who's very well known in the CSS and animations and motion world, and has been giving us a lot of super interesting insights. And we have the creator of Style Dictionary. I know it's probably being mentioned in the chat. And a few other folks such as Donna. And so the goal of this is buy-in, really. Buy-in from the community, buy-in from the tools, so that we end up with a spec that is adopted.
I think that makes sense. I'm going to create a little bit of a false dichotomy here in that. So Jina and Kaelig, along that point, how do you feel it's going from the creating of the standardization standpoint? And then the next question will be over to Nathan and Donna from a kind of consumer standpoint, working on these tools that are supposed to adopt the standards. How do you feel like it's going from your perspective? Are you seeing good of a movement there? So maybe Jina and Kaelig, are you seeing reception to as you're creating those standards? Are you seeing adoption from? Are you seeing buy-in? Maybe we'll start there.
Yeah, I would say I am starting to see various companies and tools, say, oh, we're complying. And what's interesting is that I feel like I should mention too is I keep seeing people saying, oh, we're W3C compliant. And just to clarify, we're a community group that's within the W3C group of communities, but it's not a standard coming directly from W3C. So just to clarify that, this is a community-driven thing. But yeah, so like a lot of different tools, a lot of companies are using this format for the future of their tools. So yeah, I would say adoption is definitely happening. I think Kaelig's a little bit closer to the actual spec side of things. So I don't know if you want to speak to that more, Kaelig.
Yeah, we're working closely with implementers, and by implementers, I mean, Figma, Sketch, Zero Height, and various other folks, and Supernova, and who else? Yeah, there's it's funny because there's a few implementers who are like, give us the spec. Our customers are asking for this. They're begging for a design token spec. And on the other side, there's a few other folks who are like, okay, take a step back. How do we do this the right way? And it's super interesting to balance that. I would say that when I started it, I thought we would have some sort of V1 in a few months. Oh, how wrong was I? How naive. It's actually super hard to consider all the edge cases, understand the needs that we need to address now, the needs we can address later. And again, it's a balancing act, and and we're so lucky to have a community that is engaged and active. And so there's several hundred people who are subscribed, and a few dozen people who are actually in this specification discussions and bringing up lots of interesting edge cases that we would never have thought about. And so that makes things a little longer to put together.
Right on. Donna, Nathan, what are you seeing from, are some of those standards starting to affect the work that you are doing? Or are you seeing any of those or seeing some convergence around them?
So I'll go. So for me, a lot of my design tokens works is within the organization. And because we have multiple brands and multiple products, it's still a lot of work to kind of align with the other designers from the different brands, because they're so accustomed to their particular set of like colors. Like, you know, we have a Tellus green, we have a Tellus purple, but then you'll have another brand where it's like, oh no, we have a Kudo teal and we have a Kudo orange. So they're still speaking that language rather than like, hey, how do we standardize so that we can have this consistent primary language, secondary color language? And what people are very familiar with is, again, the Google material, like, oh, look at 100 color sets and all I have to do is customize this. So yes, that is a great example to get 100 color sets, but do we really need 100 color sets right now? And those are the way our design tokens are right now. Is the beauty of it that people really see, oh, like you can switch between brands, and it's like that works if you're all talking about the same component with the same amount of variance with the same, you know, states. But like our organization is still so young and still diving into it that our focus right now is just the small piece that we can share across the board. So there's a lot of work, and that's what I see in the future is like, let's connect at that level, and then like, oh my gosh, exponentially, what else can we do?
Yeah, I would say my impression is, first of all, it helps that one of the authors, Danny Banks, like makes style dictionary. And so the level of concordance and the fact that he's one of the authors and his tool is like the hegemonic tool for translation that everybody uses at this point, I think really helps. Other authors like Kevin Powell and Louis and other people that have been participating should all feel like they're creating a spec that has value and has a lot, not just a lot of eyes on it, but a lot of people respecting the work that they do. And so the tone I hear from Supernova, Clarity, or Figma, Schema, and I talk to representatives of those products, it's all very positive and very, I don't know if deferential is the right word, but very respectful around the work that's being done and that it's creating value. And then on a personal level, like it all creates a name or a set of names of how we think about tokens that even requires people like me and all the people in this panel to change terms that they use and think about the terms they use to describe different concepts. And I find myself forwarding the spec to another team to say, here's what these things mean. Here's what the word composite means. Here's what, like, let's start using some of the things in the spec in our day-to-day language to talk about and write about and implement things around tokens. And so that also gives me a lot of confidence and hope.
Awesome. There's a lot of questions in the chat, and they're all related to what we're talking about here. So I'm gonna pull a couple from the chat. Nathan, maybe we'll start with you. We'll kind of go in reverse order than we've been going before, because I think you're doing a lot of the leading of these kinds of discussions out there right now. There's a question in the chat from Thomas. He's saying, putting aside the advocacy and education of design systems and tokens, I'd like to hear the panel discuss the need for best practices, guidance, and overall industry standards. Do we as practitioners have to be the ones, or do we wait and just influence the tool makers? So Nathan, what are you, in terms of best practices, are you seeing some emerge with the teams that you're working with? I know this is related to the idea of standardization across tokens in our industry too. What are you all seeing as best practices that are emerging or are already set?
I think that it's an interesting time because as the tool makers integrate these capabilities into their tools, they're still going to make choices. And for example, I think we've conceptually normed on kinds of tokens, that there are these basic, generic, primitive-ish tokens that are just recording the values like a hex code. There are semantic, purposeful, decision-ish things that apply across many components. That's like a second tier. And then there's the third, if you need to get there for theming, complicated tier of component-specific tokens. And so are there 3 levels? I think most people have agreed on those. Do we all use the same terms of what we call each of those 3 levels? Dan Mull and I totally argue about this in Slack back channels. And so like we haven't normed on things like that yet. And so even talking about those is a distinct challenge to what Donna was referring to, like primary versus secondary color versus default versus muted color, or whatever you call the actual levels and terms in the tokenized language that you create. And I think we're still at a point where most teams are creating their own language. And while you can draw inspiration from a Salesforce Lightning, a Carbon, a Material, all these other Shopify and so on, like we can, and Adobe Spectrum is another one. We derive inspiration from those, but it still has to be a language that you share. And the actual terms like primary versus default versus base versus standard becomes a team-specific lexicon that they're going to establish.
Donna, Jina, Kaelig, anything you want to add to that?
I was actually going to say something that I was already thinking of when you were asking Donna and Nathan, like how the spec work is influencing. And so then related to this topic, I actually think, and you know, this might sound controversial coming from me, who's been evangelizing these things since, you know, the beginning. Like and this is called the future of design tokens, by the way. So let me just go there. I envision a world where like we're not even like talking about naming tokens or how to organize them, or like it's just all in our tools. It's all integrated. It's invisible. It's just working as intended. I really want to see us get there because I think one thing we've seen as a request from some people is like, oh, can your spec also include naming conventions? It's like, well, naming conventions are extremely opinionated and could vary and could be localized and could be, you know, there's all sorts of different factors that could influence. And there are things like Nathan talked about, like primary, secondary, like those are typically common, but there's so much opinions on like how to name other things. But in my view, I'm like, you know, this is a lot of time we're spending talking about like naming things. It's like, what if we just didn't have to name anything? It just works as intended. That's what I want to see.
I love that. Jina, a follow-up question on that, and open to everybody else on the panel as well. Any suggestions or tips on how we get there, how we get to a point where this stuff becomes more opaque to our work and less deliberate in the work that we're doing?
I mean, a big thing I would think is tool adoption and people adopting the methodologies behind that. Yeah. I'd like someone else to chime in on here.
I can chime in because one of the things I'm looking at when creating token systems is the cognitive overload of learning that system and then being able to apply it meaningfully in your code and in your Figma files as well, or in your design files. That's been a problem at a few places where I've worked, where it's very hard to know as a developer, am I using this in the correct way? And my hope is that through better tooling, through frameworks that have best practices baked into them, we'll get to a point where we can have some sort of ESLint-ish way of using design tokens. I know that at Salesforce we had something somewhat similar that would, for example, tell you, hey, you're trying to use a text color on some background color here. Like that's not a thing. But that, you know, it cost a lot of time to build this thing, and so having that by default in a code base, I think would be amazing, even in Figma and other design tools.
So while we're here off of that response from Kaelig, there's a good question in the chat from Jimmy. What we've talked about tooling, we've talked about standardization. What we haven't talked about yet is a major part of design systems, which is the people part of it. So a good question from Jimmy here about, you know, any thoughts around how to work with folks who push against the idea of multi-tier design tokens and add context and intention. The contrarians often see these tiers as too verbose. For example, they may say, why do I need all these tokens? Why can't I just use Red 500? How do you start to address that in your own work? How do you object, or how do you convince the detractors that Red 500 is not the thing that they should use and they should use something else instead? Any takers on that one?
I mean, I can just tell a story of how this all went down. So at Salesforce, I was advocating for multiple tiers for more than just our color tokens. Like we were doing multiple tiers for color. I wanted to do it for spacing as well. And I definitely received that pushback of like, oh, this is too much abstraction. Like, let's just have spacing medium, spacing large, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Fast forward to, I guess we had a lot of user feedback that our UI was a little too spacey and people wanted it to be more condensed. They wanted more on the screen, and like certain parts of our products needed to be even more condensed than others. And so, you know, thinking about like the cozy compact settings, like in Gmail, for example, we wanted to be able to roll out a change, and some developers were asking, well, can't we just change the token values and call it a day? It's like, well, no, because we use spacing medium inside our buttons. We use it inside cards. We use it, you know, and so if we change it, we're changing things that we don't actually intend to change. And so we jokingly referred to this effort as the lightning tightening, but we needed to introduce those layers so that we can be very specific about exactly which, you know, even if they might be the same size right now, having that extra level of abstraction gave you the control to be able to fine tune things exactly where you wanted it. So unfortunately, that meant some refactoring time, and it was expensive, but we had to do it. And then once it was done, it was easier to manage going forward. And so I'm just requesting to consider my story so you don't have to do that, because it was very expensive and timely. I don't want to see you go through that. Just do the layers.
We appreciate the cautionary tale. Yeah. Anybody else? Go ahead, Donna.
Yeah, I would love. Okay, so that's the exact thing that like why. Okay, oh, I'm a designer. I don't know what I'm talking about. And I'm like, this is the exact reason why I wanted to join the Design Token community group, is so that I can learn this and learn about this cautionary tale and kind of bring it back to the organization. Because no, I'm not making a fake scenario up. It is a thing, and we need to like kind of future proof that work. And so this is something that I think everyone is going to experience. I know, like, I'm experiencing it, and you know, some of our development team will be like, here's the reason why we can't do that, and it's actually complex and it's gonna have rework in the future. And it's like, I don't know, I didn't make this up. Like
So I want to talk about this out of both sides of my mouth, because there's a moment when you do a token taxonomy project, or you're establishing tokens, and you've done all the audits, you've brought everybody together for the workshop, you've got a fig jam, and you get past the simple, like basic examples. And then you're like in the middle part, the kind of complex examples. And that's when like one or two developers like, can I abbreviate these things? Why do we need this level of specificity? You've got 5 levels in this thing. Nathan, I know you forwarded us your silly article, and there's 13 different kinds of levels. I don't want 13 levels. Stop the madness. And we have the moment where I think about Jina, and I say, all right, well, then let's talk about as a team our principles, because we can talk about clarity or brevity, and those things are going to come in conflict with one another. And so what do we value? And so trying to derive a principle, and particularly understanding how to make a choice against it, and that there's balance that you need to have in making those decisions, because you don't have to have 13 level token names. That's insanity. I've never seen one that's that big. But you'll reach a boundary beyond which you can't purposefully make a distinction, and you need to add a level, or you need to add some additional descriptor to that. But there's also the balance of not being too predictive in your design. Like Jina said, space wasn't a need. We just had generic spacing tokens, and you can increase specificity and add deeper and deeper and stronger opinions in your tokens as you grow. But it's really hard to strip out a bunch of opinionated tokens that you make from the outset when you didn't understand the problems, or you didn't even have problems to solve, in order to try and solve other problems that happen later. And so Kevin Powell and I, as teammates, we always use the term, and it's a terrible term, but don't predictively design a vast token taxonomy when a simple taxonomy is all that you need.
I'm going to go rogue as the moderator here, and I'm going to ask my own question because I get to do that because I have the mic. And this is to all of you. Do all properties need to be converted into tokens? Are there some that shouldn't be or don't need to be or anything like that?
I wouldn't say all. That seems pretty extreme. And also you might stifle a bit of innovation where you want things to be actually different from the system. But yeah, no, I don't think all. Also, it depends on the maturity of your design system. It depends on the maturity of, and I think of your company. I think what Nathan was talking about of predictively building, like over engineering it, is actually worse than just trying to get something down now and evolving it later. So I would say it depends.
I wonder too, Kaelig, do we need to have a better question? Like, do all properties need to be tokens? Well, what are you talking about? CSS properties? You talking about component properties? What, like, you talking about properties of land around my home? Like, what does property mean to that person? I'd want to dig in more to understand what that total set of properties is that they're talking about.
Yeah, good point. I was definitely talking about real estate. So just to qualify that, that's what I meant. But I work with a ton of teams who think that every property, every CSS property, I'll be more specific, every CSS property should be a design token instead. Because if you're writing a CSS property, then it's hard coded. And that means we're not doing something systematized and we're not doing something scale wise. And that seems like a really slippery slope to go down. But curious to know what you all think about that.
There was a debate on Twitter recently about should we tokenize zero or zero always zero. And so
or transparent. Do you need to tokenize transparent?
I think only if you think that there's a world where transparent might not be transparent, like another theme or something, but otherwise, yeah, I don't think so. I also think, there's certain things that are almost constant, like border of 1 pixel versus 0.0625 rem, it's like, is that really needed? Yeah.
All right, lots more questions pouring in the chat. I'm gonna rapid fire through some of them here. On an organizational front, there's a question from a mysteriously named anonymous attendee. I wish I knew what their name was. But they're asking, how do you ensure coherence and a closed loop between brand and design system? A lot of the stuff that we're talking about in terms of tokens are usually brand things, brand colors, primary colors, things, typography, things like that. So how do you ensure that are design tokens a bridge or a gateway to coherence between a brand team and a design system team?
Well, yeah.
And if so, how so?
The way I see it is brand is a dependency of most digital design systems, that you essentially receive your starting point and collaborate on the starting point with brand and then ensconce them in design tokens to record them and possibly extend the language, at times override the language. If brand red isn't accessible on a black background, then we need to translate that. But having tokens as a structured model gives you a platform to have those discussions with brand.
Yep, I agree. So from our perspective, the design system is a consumer of that brand guideline of the organization's values and principles, and we encompass it in our components and our processes. So for us, what brand typically is, it's media, it's print, it's product, that they have like these colors, and like Nathan said, you might have to change it a little bit to be more accessible. And you might have to tell them, hey, these colors don't exist in the brand, but we need them because we have various levels of hover and inactive and all that stuff. So it's kind of a two-way thing where it's like, thank you for this, and also please fill in the blanks and make sure that it's not that. So it's a little bit of that.
I think there was a bit about the closed loop, and I was wondering if it was talking about feedback loops and cycles of iteration or not, but I don't know if you need a very short feedback loop between brand and the token system. I think it's because the way brands evolve typically is they're not going to change their colors on a weekly or even nightly basis. So it's probably fine to do regular check-ins or ad hoc check-ins to include that brand and make sure that your system is aligned with it. But yeah, I don't think the pipeline needs to be automated in too many ways, unless for some reason your brand is evolving on a weekly basis.
Awesome. Let's go down a little rabbit hole around the technical nature of how might you accomplish certain things. So we've got a question from Jason in the chat, and Jason says, at Chewy, we've leaned into Figma tokens, newly branded Token Studio, so no longer Figma tokens, but Token Studio, to create themes for typography, color, and spacing, storing them in GitHub where they get pulled through Style Dictionary to Storybook. It's great. It's working great for web, but the native mobile teams are having a harder time working with the token JSON. Any tips, other tools, or things like that we should look at?
I've worked on that kind of integration in the past, and it sometimes went well, and sometimes there was a bit of friction and resistance on the iOS side of things, and not knowing that much about native development, I was kind of at a loss on how to make it happen and integrate it seamlessly within their workflow. But I guess that's why we need better tooling, I guess, that makes it super easy and so that it's not even a question for them to adopt it.
I'm on a similar project now where I bring a strong web bias to the spatial model of how I think about component construction and composition. And the reality is on iOS and Android, their layout mechanisms are totally different. And so the way that you choose your answers, they're not thinking padding and margin. They're not thinking in flex blocks. And that's a bias I bring to the table. And once you start saying these, like that questioner was saying, a spacing taxonomy that you can achieve with Token Studio these days, it may be biased towards a particular platform at the expense of others.
Awesome. We've got another question in the chat from Andrew. Andrew asks, do you have any tips on approaching tokens and aliases for multi-brand design, multi-brand systems?
One of the things we did at Salesforce was we did indicate which tokens were brandable, because there's certain things that maybe you're applying a color to indicate state, like warning, error, but then other things that like in those things you probably want to be constant, where the things that are brandable could be configured by the admin or the user. And so the way we had approached it was just through the naming conventions. But I think now with how robust the metadata can be behind tokens, that it could be just yet another metadata flag to indicate that this is a customizable, themable thing. I would highly recommend, if you have some sort of linting in place to help with, contrast detection and stuff, definitely put those into use in this case too, because if somebody's, putting whatever color there, you just want to make sure that you're not, breaking something.
A typical mistake I see is people just use the term theme to mean many, many different things. And when you talk about theme for a variety of lines of business or brands, that's often a level that feels prepended to your token names or at the front of your token names, as opposed to color mode, dark versus light. That is a different dimension. And so if you're thinking about theming, how can you break it down into different independent concerns that might end up becoming multiple dimensions that you want to tune?
Awesome. These are great questions in the chat. Panelists, great answers. Thank you for this. We're going to do a few more. We've got about a little under 10 minutes left. We've got a few more questions that I'll go through, and then we definitely want to spend some time, even though we've touched on it a bit already, want to spend some time getting all of your thoughts on the future of design tokens. We've sort of talked about the present and the near future. So let's do a little bit of forecasting for the future. Before we do that, one more question. Let's grab one from the chat. Let's see. Any thoughts about the benefit of building custom tokens versus using something like Tailwind, for example, building off things that already exist versus, should you make something from scratch?
I'll take that one. So at Netlify, it's my first time working on a Tailwind powered code base, and there are things that I found very pleasant in the way that you have the syntax is very easy to use tokens at least. There's a few things that I think I'm as a CSS developer for 15 plus years, I think there's mental models there that are hard to take out of me. But I understand why certain teams are defaulting to Tailwind. It just offers a few developer ergonomics that are hard to beat. One of them that I found, there are a few Tailwind themes where you know for a fact that if you use a certain color and you add 4 steps to it, it will be it would have the required contrast between a background and a foreground. So those kind of ergonomics and just tips that you learn through the system I think are pretty awesome. And if it can help teams delegate that to a framework so that they can focus on delivering value for their customers, like great, fantastic. Like please do use those pre-made libraries. Now, if you're a larger company and you care about longevity and you're trying to build a 100-year business, maybe you want to build your own solution because you're at that point where you have the scale and it makes more sense for you to just adopt your own in-house solution.
Anyone else have anything last to add to that?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna say there's a lot of times where, in our support channel, people will be like, hey, why don't we use it from this thing? Why don't we just borrow all this? Like, why isn't everything as flexible and have all the options available? And again, it's that thing where it's like, we have to start from somewhere, and starting from what our components, previously was, and then kind of add things as people request them, as we get into. And this I'm going to mention you because you brought this up in like the Instagram with like the James Bond, like in order to be reusable, 3 teams have to have it. And so it's like, why are we going to have all these options when you don't really need them right now? And if you do, request them, and then give me the use cases, give me examples why you need this in order to be added to the system.
Awesome. Makes a lot of sense. All right, we've got a few minutes left here. Let's kind of wrap up and talk a little bit about the future of design tokens. As this is the panel, we've sort of touched on that a bit already, but I'd love some closing thoughts from each of you about the future of tokens if you have them. But first, I'm going to ask a prompt to each of you, or to all of you, excuse me. And there's a little bit of a question in the chat about it, although it's more about the topic. So I will call out the elephant in the room. Was anytime we talk about the future, inevitably AI will come up. Especially nowadays, AI is very popular or timely or trendy, I should say. Do you all see AI somehow interacting with design tokens? Does that help us? Does that hurt us? Is it a completely separate thing? Do you have any thoughts about how new technologies or emerging or trendy technologies like artificial intelligence can help us to do the things that design tokens are helping us to do?
I think so, actually. First of all, I have been playing around with some of these art generators, by the way, and I'm a fan. I know they're controversial right now, but that aside, if we get to this world that, where tokens are invisible, they're just working as intended, everything's really got all the taxonomy and metadata and everything is like in place. I do see a world where I can put in a prompt and get what I need, a button with all the states and all the different variations that are needed for what I'm trying to do. And I realize that might freak people out because they're like, oh, that's going to take away jobs from designers or developers. And I think it's just our job just then has to evolve in what types of things we're doing. And to be honest, like I feel like a lot of what we do is Groundhog's Day. Is like we're designing buttons over and over again. We go to a new company, we design buttons again, and then we go to a new company and we design buttons again. And it's like, when do we stop designing buttons and let the robots do it? It's already going to be a button. It's going to have everything we need. Let's move on to something bigger and better. And so well, I love working on design systems, and I actually enjoy pixel pushing and all that. I also look forward to a world where, we're not having to focus on those things because it's just done. And then taking it beyond the token level and getting to the component level, when people are like, oh, do I use an alert? Do I use a toast? Do I use a modal? It's like, well, just put in a prompt. I want a user to do this, and the result of this action is that they get this. And then it can suggest, these are the components you need. Boom, here's your UI. And then you tweak whatever you need to tweak and you're good to go. That's where I see things going. And that might freak you out, but I'm excited by it.
Yeah, I would agree with Jina, actually. And the future of tokens, at least the near-term future for me over the next 2 to 3 years, is designer and developer tool integration, and maybe a period of acclimation as our ways of working on systems begin to just make it an assumption, and that everybody in our industry becomes increasingly literate on how it all works. I'm already a bit fatigued by all the token articles I see because they're kind of saying the same thing. And I was lamenting with one of you, I won't name names, but on Slack, just saying, I want to see new stuff with tokens because I just love it so much. But how can we think about those things beyond acclimation? I think Gina's right. Once we start talking about the schema and architecture of components and their anatomy and their properties and their states and their layout and spacing, essentially how I think about speccing out a component, once all the patterns of those things become well structured and repeatable and well definable, then yes, by the time I retire, many people will be out of jobs because that's what they do for their living. So I think that's 10 years away, but it's going to happen. And component design and development is going to become something that all of us don't spend as much time on. Experience designing is where the money's made.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of interest recently, but that's something I've been talking about internally at Shopify and a bit prior to that as well. I think as soon as Airbnb in 2015 started talking about this stuff, ideas started germinating in the industry. And the way I see things going is that you will get value to so from documenting your design tokens in natural language, you will also get value from the tools that you will plug them into. So if your token library contains a lot of really interesting use cases and documentation on how to use specific tokens in what way and why they exist, an engine could consume that and then help you explore ways of building designs that and user journeys that you may not have even thought about, and way faster than you will ever be able to crank out like 100 explorations. You know how you do those crazy eights and do a lot of sketching. I think that's something that Google has popularized with design sprints at Google, but anyway, Google it if you don't know what crazy eights are. It's a lot of sketching. The idea is to generate a bunch of ideas very, very quick. I would love to have this in a tool like Figma or Sketch to click a button and just give it a prompt and see 100 explorations. Now, there's also some tooling that is emerging, like Jordan Singer's team released Magician recently, and I think that's a step in that direction that a few people have seen and were pretty impressed by. So very cool stuff.
Awesome. Donna, any last thoughts from you about the future of design tokens?
Yeah, I always feel like I'm just catching up on like what people are doing right now, and it's kind of hard to see what the future is. But if I had to take a guess, a lot of the work that we're doing now is hopefully, again, to kind of help within the organization, have that shared language from design so that our developers can help kind of build the experiences that our designers are doing to improve the customer experience, the in-store experience. And we also have a lot of partner vendors that we work with to create new apps, microsites, that kind of stuff. And so if they're not able to go into our environment, like have our Figma and like license, have like our things, it's about them. Here's the tokens, go build in your technology, in your own design tool, and like have that cohesive branded experience.
I love it. This has been such an awesome panel. Thank you to all of you. Donna, Jina, Nathan, Kaelig, amazing answers. Thank you for all this. You've been great. For all of you who attended, awesome. Thank you so much for the great questions. We could talk for many more hours. Unfortunately, people have stuff to do. So we will call it here. Maybe we'll do a part 2. And then lastly, thank you to Supernova for hosting all of this and making this possible. We appreciate you all doing this. So that's all from us. Thank you, everybody. This will be posted soon, and then you can rewatch and see you all soon.